Hello Blender folks, riggers, animators and character makers. Welcome back for another episode of Rigs of the Trade, this in-depth tutorial series I developed on organic rigging in principle for organic characters, just like this stylized one, but it probably can also be used for other types of rigs. What I'll be presenting here is an integrated eyes rig for cartoon characters, which contains lots of interesting features. So for example, I have Eyelids rig, which is integrated with the Eyelashes rig, so they move in synchrony with some degree of automation, so I can make many interesting expressions on this character for both top and bottom eyelash. This is highly customizable, so it depends a lot on the character design. I have also an eyebrows rig, which I can manipulate from these bones. So it's a spline rig, spline skinning that I have here with bendy bone sets. These are sequence actually of bendy bone sets, and as well as I have here these stretch and squash deformations that I can make with this eye contour rig, like around the eye hole. So it is the same for the eyebrow rig actually. The eyebrows rig makes part of the eye contour rig. And some bones here are not really relevant. This side thing it's optional, but apparently it helps to keep things organized, a bit counterintuitive. Usually we'll be using mostly for the eye contour expression the top and the bottom. Okay, so you can have this stretch and squash expressions. And of course there's also this eyes track rig for posing the eyes. However, I've decided not to present the making of this eyes track rig, since I've already got a tutorial that I link here in the notes, designed for these peculiar cases in which the eyes of the character are not actually eyeballs, mesh objects, but instead eye surfaces, mesh objects. In this case I just have a single mesh object for both sides of the mesh, and this is symmetric, but it is not mirrored. It was an applied mirror modifier, but I cannot keep the mirror modifier for this case. Otherwise, these 2D image textures, you cannot control them individually, because if you move one here, the other moves symmetrically, so that's not what we want, right? This eyes track rig, I need to mention, it uses the complicated UV warp modifier. That is an object modifier that we use for this eye surface mesh object, with vertex groups assigned for each mesh. And so in this current tutorial I will still be remaking from scratch the mesh of these eye surfaces mesh object, because it's fundamental for my integrated eyes rig to operate properly. But we'll lose in the process, we'll not have the texture ready and the eyes track rig, right? So because that will be another domain, that will be a, let's say, a UV warp 2D texture domain, which I don't want to deal with those kind of stuff. Of course I would like to, but that will make the tutorial too long and too complicated. So we'll be having this kind of look, blank eye surface meshes. I hope you don't mind that. Another thing that is crucial is that we already have a properly developed and functional head bone for our model, for our character, before we start this integrated eyes rig, because as you can see there are a lot of offset disconnected parenting from these bones to the head bone. More than that, it's important because certain bone constraints here, they rely pretty much on target owner spaces in order to behave properly. And if we mess up with those spaces, if we pose the head on rest position, maybe we don't see what we're doing, but we need to pose the head to see if those bones don't lag behind or do whatever unwanted motion. So we should be able to pose the head. Here I'm posing the head through a head track bone, but we don't need that thing. If we can just expose the head through head bone itself, except that here I have to unlock lots of stuff. Okay, then we can make those tests. That's why it's very important to have this already working head bone for our rig. Okay folks, so what we're gonna do now is that I'm gonna try to explain in about 8 topics the fundamentals of each section of this integrated eyes rig. Because there are so many interdependent features, I believe this makes this a advanced rigging. Even though if we take things individually, there's not any instruction here which is overly complicated. It's just that we have to deal with lots of things and lots of concepts and functionalities altogether. And this is the most challenging thing, I believe. But then, this is why I'm making this tutorial and struggling so much to have this done. Let's start with those topics. So bear with me. We'll start by the add-ons that I'm using. So basically I'm using Bone Manager and Auto Bone Controller, which is a bit bugged and outdated, but it still works fine. And I'm not showing how to install each of them in this video, but I'll link in the descriptions. And for Auto Bone Controller, I have a tutorial series with a few episodes in sequence that I show how I'm using it without causing bugs. And just in case, preferences, so you have here Auto Bone Controller and Bone Manager. I have to give credit to some Blender folks who on the past few years have been responsible for sharing and making content that exposed the potentiality of bendy bones on organic rigging and spline skinning, and including on facial rig. I guess it mostly started with Daniel Martinez Lara in Blender presenting a whole sophisticated bendy bones for facial rig. Then Danny Mac referred to his work. Stefano Milani, another artist, made a troll character with a similar approach. Then what I believe that happened is that Vince Russell attempt to reproduce the original method with different results, but still interesting. But also very importantly, he apparently revamped the original automation add-on for the making of bendy bone sets easier. Then I'm not sure who is Bartemis, but this name is the person who has the GitHub site in which I use the Auto Bone Controller. But for me, what in Portuguese we call as an expression pulo do gato, which literally means the cat's jump. It will be ace in the hole, the expression in English. What was the ace in the hole for me, or the cat's leap, was a slug tutorial from Momotion, who didactically presented how to combine two bendy bone sets in a same sequence, which would allow to make these splines work together. So instead of having just one spline, we have multiple splines that operate in synchrony, just as if we were developing a curve inside a curve object with, for example, a spline IK bone constraint rig, which is also spline skinning, just as the bendy bones approach. But who actually discovered that precious slug tutorial for me was an artist named Kshusha that I found on a thread in Blenderartists forum. That artist was already struggling with many features involving bendy bones for facial rig on a cartoon character, and that interests me because that was a dead end for me. I only knew by that time how to make spline skinning in Blender using spline IK bone constraint, and then that connected all the dots, because spline IK bone constraint and bendy bones, they are very analogous. First fundamental topic concerns the mesh objects directly involved into it. Basically, I have here a body mesh object. I have, as you should remember, an eye surfaces mesh object and an eyebrows mesh object, so it's a separated mesh from the body. I find it easier to rig eyebrows that way. Actually, I don't know another way. Although I know some artists make eyelashes on a separated mesh object from the body. And for rigging eyelashes, this can make things much more complicated, I found out. That's why only the eyebrows are separated mesh here, while the eyelashes, the eyelids, and all the rest of the skin is part of the body mesh object. And which is optional, what I call a eyes ghost mesh object. Its main function is just to serve as a curved surface on top of which certain bones, in this case the eyebrows control bones and the eyes contour control bones, so that they could like be glued using shrink wrap bone constraints. Sometimes we want to have more freedom of deformations, and since I'm not sure what is best for me, more optimal for this kind of rig, I've just stopped using this one. If we opt to use this kind of object, in terms of visibility, we should be aware that if we add a mask modifier for it, so for example I have created a test vertex group, you see that the shrink wrapped bone with that bone constraint cannot follow anymore the hidden mesh through the mask modifier. However, the shrink wrap bone constraint still works if we just disable in viewports. You see, it is being locked there. I cannot move it beyond the limit. That's interesting. Let me hide this object because I'm not using it. And as you can see, the eye surfaces mesh object, it has got a similar shape, and so I'm actually using it for the eyelids control bones, which are these ones. So these are actually shrink wrapped indeed to the eye surfaces mesh object, which contain the 2D image texture. So this is a kind of reusing of the same mesh object for multiple functions. I find it's fine, but there is some issues to that also, because you see the extension that it goes, because of the way wave painting works in Blender, it's not exactly one-on-one transformation of the bone in relation to deformation of the mesh. So sometimes we need to extend the position to have the desired deformation. And this means that as we prepare a mesh like that, sometimes we have to have it larger than we might think. Not only larger than the rest pose of the eye holes, because of course with the stretch and squash that we have here, naturally it's good that this mesh goes beyond on a curve, not only because of this, but because of the wave painting. So we might have to extend the size of this object, but then there are some issues to that expansion. One of them, of course, is that now you see it's so much expanded. Okay, I get more deformations possibilities. However, it is cutting across the mesh. And remember, I cannot use a mask modifier here without having the shrink wrap bone constraint failing on the hidden mesh. So this is for me a dead end. So this would be a reason why to have a duplicate eye surfaces mesh object that would not be displaying, right? And that would be the invisible surface that could be any size we want. And then that could be a good strategy for this. In this case, I don't have it. I have calculated that extension of the mesh was just enough for the deformations on this character, but indeed it would be more organized if I had done the other way. This is personal. I don't like very much to have to edit these meshes and then smooth them out. If I can have it done originally, a mathematical curve, without any sort of irregularity, with this stuff then edited and then converted to a mesh object, right? This is more like a detail, but I will mention it anyways. If we take those shrink wrapped bones, and you see there's a gap in between those mesh islands from the eye surfaces mesh object. It's just one mesh object, remember? It would be more organized here if it was one mesh object for each eye, indeed.